G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Here's a dangerous idea for you. Exactly how much culpability and responsibility and blame should senior, very professional legacy media journalists bear for the disintegration of trust in modern institutions, in the mainstream media, the rise of Podcastistan and Substackistan, and I suppose the erosion of truth? I put that question to one of the most important, most influential, most experienced, most famous, most respected legacy media journalists in Australia, Chris Uhlmann. His resume is sort of too long to just rattle off and list, but he basically worked for decades as either the host or the chief political reporter on many of Australia's most important current affairs and news shows. The 7:30 Report, ABC News. He helped to kick off ABC News Channel, a 24-hour news channel in Australia. He was the chief political reporter for 9 News. He hosted the ABC's flagship current affairs radio show, AM. He's now a contributor on Sky News. He writes for The Australian, the nation's largest broadsheet newspaper. He is the guy you go to when you sort of want to hear from the voice of the traditional legacy press. And he now has a Substack, and he has a lot of thoughts about the failings of the legacy media in general, his failings in particular, in the way that he conducted certain interviews. We get into that, along with a lot of hot-button issues like climate chaos, which he and I disagree on. He's a lot more conservative than I am. Questions like Ukraine, China, Taiwan, energy independence, immigration. This is a fascinating crossover, really, between one of the sort of titans of old media and me, perhaps one of the more upstarty, puckish ne'er-do-wells of new media. I hope you enjoy, as much as I did, the one, the only, Chris Uhlmann. I want to get to Zelensky. How much foreign affairs reporting had you done? Were you ever a formal foreign affairs correspondent posted by any of the
No, I wasn't.
media
ever.
organisations? Yeah.
No, so I worked for the ABC and I worked as a political correspondent out of Canberra, which is our capital, obviously. So I covered what's federal politics. And so quite often would follow the Prime Minister around the world on the trips that they did over time. So I've certainly visited many foreign capitals, been to many of the great big meetings that we hold around the world, these great jamborees that go from different names, the G7, the G20, the Council of the Parties thing, which is the giant climate change jamboree, been to one of those. So seen all those sorts of things. And of course, when you're doing federal politics out of Canberra, a big part of it is foreign affairs. So I've always had an interest in it.
And what's that like when you're trailing around? Assume that the Prime Minister's going to the G20 or something like that. Like, where are you in the press pack physically, and how much access are you having to the PM on the road, and what are you sort of looking for as a story?
Well, unlike the US, for example, where you've got Air Force One or, the flying Qatari plane, whatever it's going to be next in the United States.
It'll be interesting to see what the press quarters are on the Qatari plane.
I'm sure the journalists won't complain once they get on board.
Or they will, or Trump will have it decked out so that there's like Ryanair-style economy class in the back for the to put CNN in, and the New York Times.
But they did that.
He's on his king-size bed.
So this is the thing with the Australian government. One of the things that the Australian governments are always worried about is that being seen to sort of big note yourself, because, in the United States, people don't mind people having success. In Australia, we've always had what we call the tall poppy syndrome, and that includes our prime ministers. So
don't want to be too showy, don't want to be too flashy, no bling.
Look, the first time I went around the world with the Prime Minister, he had what was called a business class jet, which really couldn't travel terribly far. So you have to do these little hops around the world. It wasn't that big, right? And we pull up to these events. And
he's got a little regional propeller plane or something. Not quite. But
well, yeah, in 2008, Kevin Rudd decided that he'd do a trip around the world. Now, Kevin Rudd was essentially like an international messiah, or at least he saw himself that way. He was a Mandarin-speaking Australian Prime Minister. And we thought then, like, cometh the hour, cometh the man. This guy's going to be the bridge between the West and the rising East.
He was a centre-left leader. He was coming off 2 decades of conservative rule. He was young and sunny and left-wing. He was almost like an Obama figure in 2007 in Australia.
Or Jesus. Like, if if you ask Kevin,
Chinese-speaking
he's
Jesus.
a Mandarin-speaking Jesus.
And he'd been he hadn't yet been foreign minister.
No, he hadn't.
He became foreign minister after being
yeah.
prime minister. He was shadow foreign minister, became prime minister. Okay, great.
Yeah, long story. But anyway, look, so he decides after he gets elected in 2007, he's going to lap the world and essentially leave no leader unmolested. So we started in Washington. We made our way around the world. When we got to the NATO conference, which was in Bucharest, I'll never forget pulling up in this tiny little plane alongside one of the two American planes. Like, this is a jumbo jet, and we are essentially in a tiny little business class.
I think it's a 737 or something, right? The Australian...
Well, it's bigger now. Then it was a tiny little business class jet. We had two of them. Kevin wanted to take the entire press pack with him, so we needed a lot of space.
So it's literally it's like a private jet that a businessman would fly around in.
Yep.
Okay.
It's nothing flashy.
Is it flashy on the inside?
Then. So it's changed now, but this is the first story. So, and then we pulled up alongside that. And then the Chinese, of course, had a gigantic plane. Even the Canadians had a giant plane. And we had these tiny little planes, which was good. It puts you in perspective because we are a tiny little country at the arse end of the world. And so, but eventually they did get, and this is where I was going, they did get a bigger plane, which took forever, and they had to get it through the Royal Australian Air Force, and it had to be branded for something else. Yeah, it should have just had it given it to us by the Qataris. All the Chinese would have given us one too.
Probably.
But when they did that, the then chief of staff to the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, was a woman called Peter Credland, who's actually a friend of mine. She works on Sky News now as a commentator. She put in economy class seats for the media. So you had the lovely business class seats up the front. You could lie down. You got to our section. Everyone's sitting upright.
Seriously.
As we travel across the world. And can I say to your American and European listeners, they've got no idea what long-haul flying is like. It takes us 9 hours to get to the halfway mark somewhere in Asia or, in Hawaii or somewhere before we go on to the rest of the world.
That's
so
ridiculous.
It's a long time.
And you said there are two Air Force Ones. Some people might not know. There's always a decoy Air Force One, right? So there's not just, which I've actually been wondering about with the Qatari deal. Right? They have to give them two because there's always a decoy. And you never know which one the president's in for security reasons.
I ask you this, that gift from Qatar to Donald Trump, how long do you think it's going to take the people in defence to pull that entire thing apart, check every element of it for bugs and put it back together again?
I know.
It will end up in Donald Trump's museum before he gets to fly in it.
Every single couch, every single seat presumably has to have the lining taken out of it and looking for either spyware or some kind of, I mean, even if they had like a trigger that had some explosives or something in it,
I went to a Pacific Island forum once in Micronesia, tiny, tiny little country, right? And what had happened there for this big forum was for all the world leaders were given cars to drive around in, these beautiful black SUVs that had been provided by the Chinese government. Sitting off the coastline was a Chinese warship. What do you think they were doing?
That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just providing a fleet of bugged limousines.
We'll happily take them.
Listening in, we'll take them. So you're in economy class on these little, and this was the Rudd era. And when you get to a foreign locale where the Prime Minister is doing something, what are you actually doing? Are you going to a hotel that is paid for by the news organization? Is it paid for by the government? Is it what access do you have to things?
Yeah, it's paid for by the news organisation. So even the flights across on the Prime Minister's plane, we got charged a fee for that. And then your organisation would pay
it's a cheap
for your
economy
hotel
class fee for
I think it wasn't that much.
Special.
It was reasonably cheap. I don't know what the price of it was, but we did pay a fee for that. And we paid, obviously, when we stayed in our accommodation overseas. And look, sometimes we couldn't get on the Prime Minister's plane, so we would have to leapfrog and go ahead on commercial aircraft to try and get ahead of him. And when we got to wherever we were going, then you do have really good access actually to the Prime Minister, but you don't necessarily have access to those events. So the security is so strict on some of those, particularly G7, G20 or NATO, that when the leaders meet, we might be able to send a camera in. So you can send a camera in. You quite often be able to send one journalist into the actual meeting. So you see those things, we ever see them sitting just like this, right?
Yeah.
And they'll have a little conversation. So that's a pro forma thing where they'll say, welcome, it's great to see you. And it's never not great to see you. Usually in these most meetings, even if you hate each other, you would say that's good. And then you would see that opening piece, and then you'll all be bundled out of the room when they get down to the real tin tacks of the conversation.
Yeah.
So you get to that, but then quite often you'd be pushed off into some forum where you'd watch the rest of it on a television set. And if you're working from overseas, for Australia, it's always the opposite side of the day. You end up working 24 hours a day to try and keep up. You've got to go through the day with the Prime Minister to gather all the information that you need. And then essentially you work through the night to feed the beast that is on the other side of the world. And, and things change in the time that I was in the media. So we go from just doing a 7 p.m. news report, for example. So that's our evening news. People would be aware of that around the world. So if you're in the United States, ABC, CBS, their news. So I used to do that for our national broadcaster, and then I did that for one of our commercial broadcasters. So, I would have to do a package which might run 2 minutes for the ABC, 90 seconds for Channel 9. But early on, that was it. That was all I had to do. But then I might have to do some radio as well, or radio current affairs. So there were other things to do. And then we invented this 24-hour news beast, and the thing never went to sleep. So people would be knocking on your door like 24/7, wanting you to feed this beast. And the hard part with that is, you quite often have extremely small amounts of time to try and make big calls on what you've just seen going on. So you get put into circumstances quite often where you only just have the bare bones of what the meeting was. And someone says to you, well, what does this mean for world peace?
Yeah.
And the answer is, I haven't got the foggiest idea. I have not slept in 48 hours.
Yeah.
I don't know where my room is. Sometimes I forgot my room number. So you get to the hotel and you think, I have to go ask at the desk, where am I staying?
I don't know if you've heard the adage that in the new media environment with big, long podcasts like Joe Rogan's show and so on, and also things like TikTok where everybody's just scrolling through 15-second videos, that Gen Z only consumes media that's either 15 seconds long or 3 hours long, that there's no appetite for, no one consumes anything.
That's a pretty big arc, really.
There's nothing in between anymore. And I have a hunch that that's because people got fed up with exactly what you're talking about, which is an attempt to cram into a sort of medium length of time something that is too complicated to be able to be explained in that duration of time. It's not sexy enough to want to watch it for 15 seconds, and it's not in-depth or substantive enough to actually give you very much. So you get this fairly glib sort of surface manufactured interpretation of things that don't leave you terribly much wiser. You can probably jot on a napkin in advance what Chris Uhlmann's going to say from the G20. It's going to be, well, there was a lot of talk, but as yet we don't have a firm, there's a communique about this or about that, and then, intention of free trade and climate, but, let's see where all this goes. Yawn, yawn, yawn. How do you fight that?
Yeah, look, I don't want to get too down on the mainstream media. I did it for a long period of time, and there is a real art form to try and get something compressed into 1 minute and 30 seconds to try and tell a story, and very good people can actually put that into some kind of context. I'd always laugh, though, when a politician would say to me, I can't fit that into a 30-second grab. Mate, if you can't fit something to a 30-second grab, you are not trying. If you can't get your message out, because 30-second is how long a radio news story used to run, right? So a minute would be a really long one. You didn't do that. The way that it would work in the old form television news media was that it took me 4 seconds to super you. That was to say, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, President Donald Trump, right? So that little bit of word that comes up underneath, you need 4 seconds for people to be able to clock that, and it goes. After 4 seconds, I'm looking for a reason to dump you because I've got to get on to other things. I need to fit other things in there. So it was basically trying to build this mosaic and to try and tell some semblance of a story in that period of time. And I actually think that you can actually communicate a lot in 90 seconds if you try hard. You can communicate a lot more in 2 minutes. I much prefer a long form interview, obviously, but that was not the format that we had. And for all of the faults of the mainstream media, and I'm as big a critic as anyone now of its blind spots, its really clear weaknesses, its obvious biases. But beyond all of that, most of the information that people get about their politicians now still comes from the mainstream media, still comes from journalists who are actually doing the work in there every single day, trying to find out what's going on. So everything has its place. My big fear about what's happened is that the collapse in the model, particularly of the commercial media, means that there aren't as many eyes and ears now covering presidents or prime ministers, and particularly in a place like Australia. State politics now, there's almost nobody covering that stuff, which means that, is there any surprise we're seeing sort of what would appear to be more corruption at a state level?
Because, and forget about local politics. I mean, what is the financial model for the journalist to sit at the bar near the local municipal, courthouse or, after some hearing and sort of try to understand from people who've just knocked off work what might be going on behind the scenes in some local council election? I mean, that used to be a thing. Now it doesn't exist. We just have to hope.
In 1989, when I joined the Canberra Times as a 29-year-old copy kid, after coming off the back of working as a security guard in a Storm & Packen in the western suburbs of Sydney, and I finally got to, get a cadetship at that newspaper at a very late age. This is a little local regional newspaper, obviously based in the national capital, but, we had a finance reporter and an economics reporter. We had 3 court reporters. We used to cover the High Court. We used to cover the local Trades and Labour Council, which is where our unions used to hammer out things just for the local ACT, tiny little territory, a little bit like Washington, D.C. We used to cover that. We had 5 people in Parliament House. All of that's gone. Like almost all of that's gone. I drove past the building where I used to work the other day. It's been bulldozed, right? So, and there's a certain sadness in that for me. Now, I want to let 1,000 flowers bloom. I would like to see more of this, more of what you're doing. I want people to have as much opportunity to see as many different opinions as they possibly can, because the world is full of opinions and there are some good ones and there's some bad ones. But as we enter into an era where it's going to be harder and harder to tell what is real and what is not real, I want to know that there's somebody somewhere who checked a fact. And when I saw that video of Donald Trump or Zelensky or Anthony Albanese, Australian Prime Minister, that he actually said that.
And I mean, not just that he said that, but that there's someone who has done enough interviews and is in enough with the people who are in the room when he says other things to give context to whether or not we can take it at face value, what he's saying. Like, there's a whole holistic sense of knowledge that a good political reporter, that you used to have, that's a lot bigger than the commentariat. And I mean, I've always said that, what I do, I don't want this to be the only thing in the media.
Yeah.
It's really important that the news organizations continue to have investigative journalists and on-the-ground reporters, and it's a shame that they're losing that because, and you say that most people still get their news from the legacy media. People under 40 get their news from social media. Now, it's still based on the reporting frequently of the journalists. You can't talk about a thing unless someone has reported on it in the first place, but everything's going through this prism, this looking glass, this kaleidoscope of other opinions before they get to it. They're not hearing anything from the source objectively anymore. It's all coming filtered through someone like me, which is a worry.
Yeah, well, you're not as much of a worry as some other people.
Thank you.
But some of them are a very big worry. And this is like, the thing is, what we're seeing now is more and more extreme voices in the media environment as well. And when I say the media environment now, I mean in every one of its iterations, it's still a media environment. Now we've got all of the different forums. I mean, it's hard to know where to look. And this is one of the things I think about being a world leader now, being a national leader in a place like Australia, is if you have a serious message to get out to the Australian people, how do you talk to them? Now, once upon a time, if you decided that you were going to say something, you would go on the 6 p.m. newses in Australia. So that was where most Australians, 6 p.m. every night, there'd be destination television. You would get to 2/3 of the Australian population and you could get a message out. And you could say, there's COVID, for example. But that was different because that was a time everyone was focused across all platforms. But if it was something else that, didn't necessarily excite the interest of TikTok or whatever, how do you get a message out now? How do you talk to your people, and how do you communicate complex messages? And like, you can do it on forums like this. And so I hope that people do listen to forums like this. When you're talking about things like immigration in Australia, it's a nuanced argument, right? It's not a black and white argument. When you are talking about the number of people in Australia, you're not just necessarily talking about where they're coming from. You can just be talking about on environmental grounds. How many people can a water poor country like Australia sustain? We should have that conversation. That's an environmental conversation. All too often, though, when you say the word immigration, the next word out of someone's mouth is racist. And you'd find this, mate. Like, there are too many people who have too many stop clauses on conversations.
Yeah.
And I find, and it's on both sides, extreme right, extreme left, is they've all got their stop clauses. They'll all pull out the stop sign at some stage. But in what I do recently, it's more often from the left than from the right.
Yeah.
Like, you say, I want to talk about immigration, racist.
Yeah.
Oh, can we please talk about net zero, climate change denier? It is, these are complex things.
Yeah, I mean, people have taken, there are a couple of things going on, right? I mean, one is that in the past 5 or 10 years, we've had this swing on the left from believing in economic equality, class and uplifting people who are disadvantaged, a sort of basic egalitarianism, a material egalitarianism that defined the trade union left historically, to a much more identitarian, almost language game where everyone's vying to demonstrate their fealty to a new set of precepts about race and gender and sex and whatever it might be. And so there's that. And then that happens a lot in the conversations that you see in the legacy media where, we're sort of constrained about what you can say if you're on a panel show or something without enduring an enormous amount of shit on social media or sometimes even the mainstream press. But then there's this other tendency which happens on current affairs shows and the news where, and I wonder if it's because of how short the interviews are, I understand the reticence of a Prime Minister who wants to get his message out. If he goes on a show like the 7:30 Report, which you used to run on the ABC, which is the nation's flagship current affairs show, let's say, on the national broadcaster, the questions can be really, I don't want to say tough, because it's good for a journalist to ask tough questions. They can be really gotcha and sort of disrespectful and kind of inconsequential in the long run, but they're set up to create a hostile moment between the host and the Prime Minister by trying to catch him out on either some inconsistency between what he's saying now and what he used to say, or some way in which he's like, there's less of an attempt to really drill down to the bottom of the point and understand him and then expose it as being, either true or false. And there's more of an attempt to, it seems to me, get the interviewee to say something that is going to go viral in some way, And I don't think that's constructive either. So the Prime Minister is left with few options. They can go on 60 Minutes or some other credible show and risk that happening, or they can sit down with a busty, good-looking Instagram influencer for 2 hours and have a nice chat, who's sympathetic to their political cause, or a Joe Rogan. And they can get no questions at all. We don't seem to have found a way to do what I'm trying to do, which is have the conversation that's free of bullshit and is sort of harsh and confrontational and a little bit provocative and spicy without being intended in a state of ill will to try to trap the person.
Yeah, well, that's an intellectually honest way of going about things, and I can put my hand up to the fact that I have been guilty of just what you charged, right? So in working on 7:30, and I remember one interview in particular, and it was with Julia Gillard, and I can't remember with which budget it was. So she was our first, former Australian Prime Minister, our first female Prime Minister. And one of the problems that Julia Gillard had was that she had essentially risen to her job by taking out her own leader. So she'd knocked off Kevin Rudd, who we spoke about earlier, to become Prime Minister herself without going to an election. And then we did go to an election and she did win enough votes to be Prime Minister again, but she always suffered from the fact about the way that she got her job. And it really did change the way that she talked in public. If you saw her before she was Prime Minister, she was one of the most fluent people in Parliament. She's a highly intelligent, really articulate woman. But what happened was after the whole unpleasantness with Rudd, she basically became more and more constrained by the job. And you could see that reflected in her language and even in her body language. It really affected her. Anyway, I was interviewing her after one of her budgets. And I knew that one of the real issues that she had with the Australian people was this idea of trust. Right, so I began that interview by saying, because there are some real inconsistencies in this budget, right? Do you think the people of Australia trust you when you say you're going to? It was completely unfair because I did not give her the opportunity at the outset to be able to say, look, Prime Minister, you've just brought out a budget. You tell us what you think it is before we start talking about some of the things that I might think it is. And it was precisely that. It was precisely to try and find a way to wheedle away at her major weakness. I justified it to myself at the time because I thought there were a whole lot of inconsistencies, like there were mistruths in the way that this budget was being expressed, particularly when it came to the fact that they were cutting defence spending and they said that they were going to lift it. But by the by, if I was to say that I was ashamed of one interview, I'm ashamed of that one. Did I learn something from that interview? Yes, I did, because quite rightly, I copped a lot of criticism for the way that I conducted it. And it did cause me to stop and think about the way that I conducted my own business, to start to think about how much of this is your own ego on display rather than trying to get out information. Because in the end, what is the point? Like, I go back to the basics of this. I think the point of journalism, of good journalism, of being a reporter, and that's what I am. I don't describe myself as anything else. I am not an expert in anything. I have interests in certain areas. What I'd always say to people is that, I'm not that smart, but I know a lot of people who are. And if they can explain things to me, I'm pretty good at explaining them to other people. That's what I can do. I can tell a story, hopefully an engaging story, that can help you understand a point, and sometimes quite a complex point. And I hope to do that fairly and accurately. That should be the job, right? That's the basis of that. It should be of service to the people who are listening to you, like the people that you're trying to help understand things. When I fail to do that, that's the biggest fail I can have. When I am not fair and accurate, that's the first thing my first editor said to me, just be fair, just be accurate. Try and give all perspectives on a story. And you can't always do that. Be aware of your own biases. We all have them. You can't stand outside yourself when you are telling a story. There is no other place to stand.
Did you know during the interview with the Prime Minister that it was not the way that you wanted to start the conversation?
No, I'm thinking at the time, I thought, at the end of that, like it was like, and I've had plenty of these, like tough conversations where at the end of an interview, either when the microphone goes off, and these have been with prime ministers, I've had them sit there waiting for the microphone to be turned off so they could tell me precisely what it was that they thought of me. And one of the great things about being an Australian journalist is that Australian politicians, when they want you to know that they're unhappy, they speak in words of 4 letters.
Yeah.
And for quite some period of time. And I have had those conversations with prime ministers, with opposition leaders, or with ministers. And I'm usually grateful for them too, because
that's risky. But if there's a microphone in the room, that's risky. Even if you've gone off the air, right? You never know what editor or director is going to have a copy of that tape. But how did Julia Gillard respond at the end of that?
She just got up and left.
Right.
She just stood up, turned around and left. And I never really had, because the other thing too is that one of the most useful things to a politician is to be able to, and you can do this, it is that, particularly if you're working for one of the big outlets, is to pick up the phone and have a private conversation with the Prime Minister and say, tell us what's really going on. Go down to their office and do that. And I've had the privilege of doing that. And so, so that was the least of the things that I lost. What was the most of the things that I lost? Well, self-respect for myself at the time, in the days and weeks after that. So, it is, I do think that you are being dishonest if you don't reflect on your own behavior constantly reflect on your own behavior and constantly try to measure yourself against those things which you believe in. And what are the foundation stones of the things that I believe in when I'm trying to tell a story is that I should try and be fair.
Have you spoken to Julia Gillard since then?
No, I haven't. It's one of those things that I have thought about it and I've thought about writing it to her, but I wonder, you do wonder whether or not they think, what's this all about? Feeling sorry for yourself? Is it a genuine apology or just feeling bad about yourself?
That's not, for a former seminarian, that's not very Christian of you.
And that's true. It's true. Constantly struggle with the things that you believe in your own faith. And, but no, I haven't is the answer to that question.
Would you?
Yeah, I've certainly thought about it a lot. Yeah. So I might.
You can apologise to her now if you want.
Yeah, look, I am genuinely sorry, but I think that it's something that I need to do personally. I don't think that it's something that I should broadcast.
It's fascinating. I mean, that idea of you want to confront the person in power with their greatest flaw, and yet when you have time to do so, I've always felt that the best way, if you suspect that the person you're interviewing is untrustworthy, to demonstrate to the viewer that they're untrustworthy, is to try to allow the person to show it somehow, right? There's this idea, and this is a big deal in podcastistan as well, where people who are not professional journalists just turn on a microphone and think that the way to own another person, and they're going to get clicks on Twitch or on, YouTube or something if they do so, is to hammer directly the point that they're trying to make and prove that the person is wrong. This is a very kind of like Ben Shapiro or like Destiny type of way of attacking a conversation. But I've always felt that, if you suspect that someone's a hypocrite, then allow them to demonstrate their hypocrisy. If you suspect that someone's lying, allow the viewer or the listener to go, hang on, they sound like a bit of a liar here. And there's no forum that I'm aware of in the legacy media that has the time and space to allow that to take place, right? I mean, where is the half-hour or hour-long interview conversation on a commercial television station or radio station? You sort of have to, I'm kind of giving you a pass here on the Gillard thing. If you don't go for the jugular right off the bat, then the point doesn't get made in an 8-minute interview. I mean, if it was even 8 minutes, that would be long.
Yeah, look, that was quite a long one. It's usually with those after budget things, they're probably about 12 minutes. And again, I think there is a skill in that, and I think you can get somewhere in that. And in terms of why you go for that form of gotcha journalism, it's because so much of politics now is essentially repeating rote lines, and you are trying to get people in a short period of time to see the fact that there's this armor on and they're avoiding a question. I remember once I asked Kevin Rudd 8 times what would be the consequences of a rapid withdrawal from Iraq, and the interview I think went through for 4 or 5 minutes. I just had one question. I think at the end of that, people pretty much got the idea that this guy was either unwilling or unable to answer that question. So there is a point in some of that. And so, yes, why is the reason some people go for the gotcha question is because, we're sitting in an area where both sides know what the truth is and one side doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
So that's where you get into that sort of conversation. But still, like, there were no excuses for the way that I conducted that. I did learn something from that and hopefully have applied it in the future.
You mentioned Zelensky on a recent trip abroad. You sat down with Zelensky. Was it last year? No, last year?
It was 2023.
Year before last. What was the context around that, and what did you make of the guy? Where were we in the Ukraine war?
Okay, so we had been essentially, it was, in the second year of the Ukraine war. We were there in October of that year. A friend of mine, well, he's a friend now. In fact, I'd retired from the mainstream media. I'd pulled the plug. I was exhausted and had spent a better part of a year doing pretty much nothing. And then I realized that some days I couldn't tell you what I'd done all day. And then a mutual friend had contacted us, said that they'd raised the money to do a documentary on what Australians were doing to assist the war effort in Ukraine. And when you look, there were quite a lot, well beyond the military equipment that we were providing to Ukraine. And so, we went to Ukraine. We got down to the front line. It was an extraordinary experience. We saw where the Australian Bushmasters, which are a big armoured vehicle, were being used, But we also obviously...
The Bushmasters, if people are not aware, are an incredible military asset.
They're way better than your Hummers.
They're one of the greatest Australian engineering inventions. And they're really... I got a text from a mate of mine who works for the Wall Street Journal. He's a Brit who has spent a lot of time in Ukraine. He's based in southern Europe. And they send him in and they send him into Gaza and all this sort of stuff. And he texted me saying, like, these Bushmasters, the Ukrainians... You ask the Ukrainians what their most dependable asset is militarily, and they'll talk to you about the Australian Bushmasters until your head falls off. And he's not even an Aussie. He's like, these are not tanks. These are military.
They're armored personnel carriers.
Armored personnel carriers, and they were important in Iraq, but even more important in Ukraine because Australia is the main sort of source of this vital, very, very hardy piece of equipment that they can get around in without being blown up.
Yeah, they're designed to keep people alive as they go to and from the battlefront. And what they're being used for a lot for in Ukraine is essentially as field ambulances. And I'll never forget that going out to that front line, we saw them during the day with some of the troops. But then we were trying to find this combat nurse, Hannah Havana. We desperately wanted to speak to her. And we got lost basically near the front line in Ukraine. And we were going on this dirt track as it got dark at night time. And then in the end, we finally found the village that we were looking for. We couldn't set up outside because if we put up lights, we were
Sitting
in
duck.
danger.
Yeah.
And so we all piled into the back of this bushmaster with this combat nurse who had this faraway look in her eyes, like the things that she had seen. Her husband was a driver. The two of them were on the front line. There was dried blood in the back of this thing. And so that's the way she got on and off the battlefield. And the bushmaster is brilliantly designed so that, if it runs over a mine, it's got this V-shaped hull with a whole lot of water in it, so there can be explosions underneath it. They survive. These things are bullet riddled. But the thing that struck me then about talking to her was I asked her what it was. She must have seen some terrible things. She was speaking Ukrainian. She just said, "Duh, yes, And what do you think about now?" And she said, "I've been thinking, my husband and I have been married for a long time. And I've been thinking about life. I've been thinking about having children. We never were going to have children, but now I think I want to bring life into the world." So
Wow.
there in the absolute depths of darkness was this tiny little light of hope, of someone who wanted to give life, to bring life into the world, even to the very worst of circumstances, to make it just that little bit better. And that for me, again, is the essence of humanity, is this unquenchable hope. It is that if you find a why, you can bear with almost any how. And she was doing that. And look, that's the thing I found. Like, if I found anything in Ukraine, it was finding that and finding that indomitable human spirit. And then in the conversation with Zelensky. So it is, and the thing that was really great about that conversation is we asked him to speak in English. Now, English is his third language. His first is Russian. His second is Ukrainian. His third is English. Remember that when you see him quizzed in front of a White House press gaggle with a president and a vice president going at him. This guy is communicating in his third language. But he did speak in English to us because he wanted to communicate to an Australian audience. And so we were really grateful for him doing that. And what did he say to us on that again? What did we find in the midst of war when I asked him what it was about, why he fought? I mean, you think about this. This is a guy who could have taken the opportunity to flee the country, as so many leaders do when things get hard. He was offered a ride, as he said, "Well, I don't need a ride, I need ammo." He decided he would stand and fight. And that spirit helped his people stand and fight by his side. And I asked him why, and he said, "What is a life without freedom? Without the ability to do what you want to do, to say what you want to say. What is a life? It's nothing." And that's what the people of Ukraine are fighting for, the right to a life lived on their own terms without interference from somebody else. And so that is something worth fighting for. And that, I think, again, along with seeing Hannah on the front line and speaking to Zelensky, that what did I take away from that? I took away the fact that, you know what? Humanity is an amazing thing. People are amazing things. The one choice we get is how to respond to the circumstance in which we find ourselves. It's what was in Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Even in the Holocaust, in the camps, there were some people who hoarded the food that they had and some people who shared it. You are radically free. You get to decide how you respond to the things that happen to you. That's what matters.
What do you make then of the, I suppose, shift in the way that many people are thinking about not just Ukraine, but a lot of conflicts, and you could loop in Gaza here as well, where there's, let's just say, an overly simplified version on both sides that seems to lack an insight into the messy complexity of the decisions that people are making on the ground. Especially on the right in America, there's this kind of sort of great power kind of shrugginess about Ukraine, where it's like, well, of course Russia wants to control its own backyard. We would feel the same way. Look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. We didn't want, we have our Western Hemisphere, they have their Eastern Hemisphere. Ukraine's only been a country for a few decades anyway. So what's the big deal ultimately? Make a deal, shake hands, draw it up on the map and stop the bloodshed, because bloodshed is bad. So therefore, because bloodshed is bad, stop the war. Does your compassion, which sounds quite Christian when you talk about it that way, your compassion and your sense of the inherent dignity of each individual casualty, lead you towards or away from like a perpetuation of necessary wars? Like, because I could take it both ways, right? I could say, well, if that's the case, just stop it. Just draw the lines where they're going to end up.
Yeah.
And just stop the killing. But stopping the killing might mean that in 5 years' time, Putin comes back for another bite.
Precisely. And the answer to this is, if there were simple answers to these things, someone would grasp them, because the one thing politicians want more than anything else is simple answers. And unfortunately, they're not that simple. Look, the war in Ukraine can only be ended by a settlement through peace and diplomacy. And at the moment, the Ukrainians are on the back foot. They are going to have to give up some territory if they want to have peace. The gamble that they will all make is that the end of it? Is that the last demand?
They just want that to not be a gamble, though, right? I mean, right. I think everyone understands, including them, that they're going to give up some territory. The question is, under what conditions, and is there like an international force, at that border that sort of somehow NATOizes the eastern border such that Russia can't come back? Do you actually have French and Spanish troops, permanently stationed in Ukraine as a deterrent? Is that what's your judgment?
Well, look, the one thing that the Ukrainians genuinely wanted in order to try and do something about where the war was headed in 2023, in fact, they were doing better. They were doing well then. They had taken back some territory and they've lost ground since then. So they wanted Americans on the ground in the Ukraine. Why? Because the Russians don't want to take the chance that they might kill some Americans and then drag the United States into the war. And none of us want that, right? None of us want the United States in that war, because we don't want a war between Russia and the United States, because it would not necessarily, but could end in nuclear war. And we want to all avoid that. So the question...
I'm not sure I'd hate America having been involved from day one, because I think Putin would have blinked. No, I mean, I'm disagreeing. I'm not. Yeah. I think Putin would have backed down.
Yeah, it would have been a gamble, though, right? So that's just it.
Yeah.
It's a gamble. How far do you push this guy? Yeah. And look, the other thing too is that, I pay close attention to what Vladimir Putin says, because one of the things about him is that he was an intelligence officer who spent his entire life watching the United States. He has that country and the West sorted out way better than we do. He saw the weaknesses in our society way before we did. One of the things that he did, which is really interesting, and he may well believe it, but I think that it was a political thing, it was essentially that he rebirthed the Orthodox Church inside Russia. So, the Soviet Union crushed this thing, but he brings the Orthodox Church back to life, essentially. And then he pictures himself as the only Christian leader left in the world, which resonates with the right in the United States. It's like, we don't go in for this gay stuff. We don't go in for all of this sort of stuff that's tearing your society apart. We believe what you believe. So that's been a very effective campaign. Well, I think a lot of the sympathy that's on the right in the United States for Putin comes from that. And he's been working on that for a very long time.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I think that, it's that he understands that. And both he and Xi Jinping recognize that the West, they believe, is in terminal decline. The West, after the Second World War, the United States basically presided over a whole range of organizations, which we now know by their acronyms: the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization. All of these things were well intended to try and stop what we saw, the cataclysm of the Second World War, and to settle the world in a way where it wasn't what we're going to see from Thucydides, which is the strong do as they will and the weak suffer as they must. We tried to get away from that. We had some success with that. It was more successful in some parts of the world than in other parts of the world. Can I say, you never want to be living under a superpower? So I think the entire Western Hemisphere, like down through South America, would have thought they didn't get a great settlement out of what happened after the Second World War. The United States was constantly interfering. Let's face it. The problem with the West moralizing about these things is all the things we accuse the other side of, we've usually done first. We've done ourselves.
Well, not quite as bad.
Economic coercion from China is a bad thing, but when we do sanctions on Russia, that's a good thing. When we invade another country, for example, going looking for weapons of mass destruction, which aren't there in the Iraq War, and I think the great catastrophe of the 21st century has been that invasion of Iraq.
G'day, humans. Well, if you've listened to this much of the episode, then you must enjoy it, presumably, unless you're just listening for masochistic reasons. So you should listen to the rest of it. And the way you do that is by subscribing to the premium feed, where you not only get to hear the rest of this delightful conversation, and trust me, it gets better than what you just heard, but you also get to hear no ads, 0 ads. And previously, up until now, you had to go to the old Substack to do that and follow me on Substack and add one more platform to your life if you're not already on Substack. But here's the thing. We are now on Apple premium podcast as well. So with one click, Apple will just subscribe you up to the premium feed. You'll be able to listen to the rest of this conversation right now. So open up your Apple Podcasts, click the old Pay Old Zepsy button. That's probably what it's called, Pay Old Zepsy. And you click the button, and then you no longer have to be a free rider. You can feel like you're contributing to the mission of this show, which is really what we're all here for: better conversations, a freer, more freewheeling attitude towards the things that we can talk about, a way to steelman our opponents and to take the most gracious approach towards disagreement. That is what you're voting for when you vote for Uncomfortable Conversations by going into your Apple Podcasts and clicking subscribe. I love you. If you don't do that, that's fine. I'll see you the next free episode, I guess. Take care.